Okay, hello everybody. My name is Chandler, and I am going to walk you guys through the first chapter of our book, which is called Defining Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Pedagogy. This is a very straightforward chapter, pretty introductory. The basis of this chapter was to define the meaning of culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive teaching, and give some historical mapping as well as how it is going to appear later on throughout the book, the term that will be used throughout the book. While we go through this, be aware of a couple of different things for the assignment. You will need to be able to identify the single term that will be used throughout and give its definition. And then there are going to be 4 key aspects of being what it means to be culturally and linguistically responsive that you'll have to note. And then there are 7 separate identities that we are made up of that we will talk about later on in the book. And then one of them that is excluded in our cultural behavior makeup, and you'll need to be able to tell me which one that is. So, that being said, let's move forward. So, first subsection is called What is in a Name? This was talked about the importance of giving a name to a concept and sticking to that name, why that's important, and the idea behind that. So, this chapter, or the subsection, is about what it means to be culturally responsive, what it means in this book versus what it means in the world and the different perspectives of this idea. The relevance of this idea is more than just racial identity, the achievement gap that they talk about, and different diversity issues, but speaks more to the practice of instructional transformation and improving student-teacher relationships, as well as increasing the overall student achievement. There have been many different names and definitions given to the idea of culturally and linguistically responsive teaching that have over time kind of diluted its meaning, lessening its effectiveness and what they refer to as the staying power within educational settings. The staying power, like the idea of having staying power, to me, I read that as its emphasis, its weight, its importance, and like if you know, all these different names have lessened the staying power and been used so many times, it's lessened its effectiveness and its value in teaching and so the other thing they talked about is how having clarity in a single meaning can be more important than agreeing on a collective specific understanding of a concept, which is why they take so much time in the first part of this chapter to really nail down what we are going to address and what the concept and how it all came about. So the one thing that they wanted to really touch on is why this was so important, and they ended this subsection talking about the fact that what we call something, the label that we assign to things, it holds significance. It holds significance to us, and it speaks and it kind of identifies the value that we place in something. And so this being a important subject, they wanted to really nail down what we are talking about and why. And so, we get culturally linguistically responsive pedagogy. So, what does culturally and linguistically responsive teaching mean? So in the book, they establish a singular use of the concept culturally and linguistically responsive teaching, as well as a singular term by which it is going to be referred, and that is culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. The author decided on this term for several reasons. Culturally and linguistically responsive teaching makes a clear distinction between the idea of racially responsive teaching and the intricacies of culturally responsive teaching and what that specifically entails. And so this looks into more than just race by having a more, they refer to it as an anthropologic view. It is also used to emphasize the importance of language in different cultures and speaks to the use of pedagogy versus teaching and learning. They refer to pedagogy, and it refers to the practice of teaching. In general, like that's the definition, the term for it. But the author emphasizes the how and why of teaching, the strategic use, and the reasoning behind certain instructional decisions, why something is made, why they decide to do it this way instead of that way. And without this understanding, we can't really fully understand and know how to best reach and respond to our students and the diverse needs that they come with, and who they are and what makes them who they are. And so culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy is what we were going to use and what we're going to talk about for the remainder of this book. So, defining culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. Two important pieces of this concept were books written by Gloria Billings and Geneva Gay. Billings' book, this picture right here of the little boy, is the cover of her book called Dream Keepers. That was the first national level groundbreaking book that defined, or writing really, that defined the concept of what it meant to practice culturally and linguistically responsive teaching. And we're going to look at that just a little bit here. Her definition of this term, this concept really, is a pedagogy that empowers students intellectually, socially, emotionally, and politically by using cultural and historical reference to convey knowledge, to impact skills, and to change attitudes. So, as educators, we and already teachers that practice this concept that she describes here do that by supporting student learning and creating different social times and interactions that allow them to meet standards and have success, as well as achieve their own personal and important cultural experiences, to have those things and to experience them while they're in school doing the academic part. The next piece that we will look at, or really kind of just touch on, is the book by Geneva Gay. It is called Culturally Responsive Teaching, Theory, Research, and Practice. She was credited in our book for adding the idea of a pedagogy to the culturally and linguistically responsive teaching theory and concept. Her definition of this is the use of cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. So her idea of pedagogy implies that using this culturally and linguistically responsive method, you end up teaching to the students and through each of their individual strengths. So you teach to that strength, and then you use that strength and teach through it to more powerfully reach your student and incorporate this entire idea. Both of these items, both of these books and these ideas that are talked about in there, have in common a key fact that they take into account the students' cultural and linguistic influences, the things that influence them, and they serve those specific needs and ideas. So, a little bit more on this. Culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, it's going to be referred to in the book and throughout this slide presentation as CLR, CLRP for pedagogy, T for teaching. It's kind of used interchangeably. But that definition is the validation and affirmation of the home culture and home language for the purpose of building and bridging the student to success in the culture of academia and mainstream society. So the idea, you'll see the bullet points for validation and affirmation below. The idea of validation and affirmation in this definition is to emphasize the intentional effort to support home culture and language, as well as breaking down some old historically inaccurate stereotypes and perspectives that we can hold sometimes intentionally and unintentionally. We're going to look at a video in just a second, but the overall overlapping idea of this culturally linguistically responsive pedagogy means that we as educators need to meet our students where they are currently, both culturally and linguistically, and help to grow them to where they need to be academics. So we need to go to where they are, being culturally responsive or linguistically aware and responsive, and use that method to bring them to where we need them to be to meet standards and for them to be academically successful. That's our goal and what we need to use this idea and this concept to do. So this video is going to talk a little bit about the benefits of teaching with the CLR mindset. We are going to take a quick look at it. It's not very long. I think it's like 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. Or a minute.
What we're doing is demonstrating how culturally and linguistically responsive teaching looks in the classroom. Validation and affirmation of home language and home cultural behaviors through instructional activities for the purposes of building and bridging the students to success in academia and mainstream culture. That really starts with 4 general areas of instruction: classroom management, academic vocabulary, academic literacy, and academic language.
Can you find more than one meaning for each sentence? You guys read.
Nancy fed Tom the big gray cat.
It adds engagement to math because sometimes a subject is not highly favored by the students.
We got to be open to try new things because obviously the ways in which we have worked in the past don't work for all kids.
It's really important to me that we all see each other as a team, because when things get really hard in this class, I want them to be able to know that they can depend on each other. And so CLR for me works really well both with accessibility and with that idea of community building and validation for who they are and where they come from and what they bring to the table.
Now I look at culture in through different eyes. It's made me a better teacher. It's made my students more engaged every day in the classroom. The students just seem like they're getting it better.
And it really gels it for them, and they realize at that point that this belongs to them.
And it helps you to keep that energy you want to have with them.
It's amazing how well they're able to retain.
Using the different strategies and letting the students guide my teaching, that helps me to be able to relate it to them.
Okay. So, okay, so we're going to talk about the next subsection. It's called the benefits of culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. So the real question of this subsection is not necessarily what the benefits are of culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, but rather who that concept and who that practice benefits, who can benefit from it. So that being said, the book says that all students benefit from it. They can all benefit from it, and they do, but they are more specifically noting that the students who benefit from it the most are those that are being underserved. They are the larger target. So who is an underserved student? The book defines an underserved student as any student who is not successful academically, socially, and or behaviorally in school because the school as an institution is not being responsive to that student's needs. So we're going to look at who are the students most likely to be underserved. Who are the kids that fall into that definition? So looking at the slide here, we have a list of the demographic that our book said would be the most likely to be underserved. So now it would be, up here it says African American, Mexican American, Native American, Samoan, Asian American, and Eastern Asian immigrants. So after identifying who those students are that tend to be underserved, the book gave a great example to kind of put this into perspective of looking at how we serve under the underserved kids in our school system. What they ask you to do is to pretend that we have asked all of the kids in general. We asked all of the underserved students to gather in the gym. We obviously know who those students would most likely be because we've just read that list. But we invite those kids to the gym, and then talks about how these students need to be better served. That's how you identify them. But then those students need to be better served simply because they're in the gym, because of their place in the gym, without regard to race or ethnicity or language. We serve them because they fall into the category of the underserved, not because of who they are racially or otherwise. We just serve them simply because they're there and they deserve to be served better. They liken it to a customer at a store who is receiving poor customer service. They deserve better service simply because they do. And it's the same kind of concept with our students. They may fall into a specific racial category, but that's not why we serve them. We serve them because they deserve to be served and to receive the best service the school and we as educators can provide. So then they tell you to kind of wrap up that example to better understand why these students find themselves in our theoretical gym, our gym of the underserved. We need to examine a few different areas of why they might be in that gym, or why they tend to fall inside of that category. So we look at three different things: the socio-historical, we're going to look at sociopolitical, and sociolinguistic context. But the first one is the socio-historical context. So a main difference that we need to understand is the mark between involuntary and voluntary immigration. The book talks about the group of involuntary immigrants that came to America through things like colonization, enslavement, various other not so legal practices. Those are the groups that are more likely to fall and find themselves in the achievement gap that they refer to in here. And the main hugely emphasized difference between the group of involuntary and voluntary immigrants is in the idea of assimilation. So it talks about how the voluntary immigrant, through a voluntary process, chose to come to America and chose to take on a new culture, chose to learn a new language, and just that kind of process. And the involuntary immigrant went through the more forceful process, resulting in unsuccessful assimilation into a new culture that they didn't necessarily want to be a part of or have a choice to be a part of. And so assimilation was an absolutely crucial piece of this. You either wanted to and you put the effort in and learning a new culture and mainstreaming and all that kind of stuff, or you didn't and you had to do it, but then you also were limited in the culture and the mainstream activities and skills and education that was offered to you, because it wasn't offered equally to the voluntary immigrants and the involuntary immigrants. So then the next part we look at is the socio-political context. This talked about the kind of the same thing, or along the lines of the same thing we talked about in the last piece, the socio-historic context. This talked about deculturalization, the denial of home culture and language were a large means to completely eliminate the cultures that were brought over. These would be like the involuntary immigrants that came. That is known as deculturalization, which we've talked about a bit in class already. Deculturalization is defined as the educational process of destroying a person's culture and replacing it with a new culture. And it's said in the book to be one of the most inhumane acts someone can do to another person. Forcefully taking that from somebody and forcing them into something else that they don't want and that isn't their own, and being insensitive to that whole process. And it's just... another term for this process is the process of stripping someone's culture from them, and not fully allowing them to assimilate, and not fully providing them with the same educational and linguistic opportunities that everybody else has, is the idea of subtractive schooling. And that is defined as limiting or removing important social and cultural resources from students and painting them as undesirable. So taking something, cultural piece of something from somebody, and telling them not to do it, not to practice it, not to speak that language, and painting it in a negative light. As educators, it is our responsibility to pay attention and understand the different cultural behaviors that we see from our students that need to be fostered and that need to be validated in our students. It's an important, crucial to them, and we need to uphold that and be sensitive to those things. Then the final piece for understanding the students that we find in our theoretical gym of the underserved is the socio-linguistic context. Another grouping of our underserved students is their use of what is called a non-standard language, something that they speak at home, something that is not standard for wherever we find ourselves. They likely come from a historic line of family members that were at one time denied the use of their home language, and so that has trickled down in their family history. These students can oftentimes be seen as lazy or as having a cognitive deficiency, language deficiency, lack of interest, disruptive. But that stereotype and that immediate labeling of any of those categories is, they put it in the book as being an overgeneralizing a socioeconomic behavior to an ethnocultural behavior, which is essentially you say that someone, oh well, he's just lazy because he doesn't speak English, or he won't speak English, or he can't speak English, or any of those things. You're oversimplifying that. You oversimplify a behavior because you are assuming something. You're not taking into account where this could come from, their home life, the language they speak at home. You don't take into consideration any of that cultural background. And so they call it an overgeneralizing of a socioeconomic behavior to an ethnocultural behavior. That gets referred to several more times throughout this chapter. So we then move on to the subheading of the purpose of culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy. This was a short little section, but it essentially spoke to the needing to find a balance between teaching to standards and teaching to academic efficiency, and keeping cultural diversity at the forefront of serving our students. So we need to find that super delicate but super essential balance of meeting those standards and doing those things, and getting everybody to where they need to be, but also being aware and sensitive to the diversity of the kids that we will find ourselves with, and the intention of that. So the next part, which is the same overhanging of the purpose of this whole idea of being culturally linguistically responsive, is eliminating the deficit perspective. So, in hand with the purpose of this concept and this idea and this practice, we look at the need to eliminate a deficit perspective that we, again, may unintentionally or intentionally be approaching life with and different circumstances with. So the perspective we might not want to acknowledge is that oftentimes students are being blamed for what is perceived as a failure. The culturally linguistically diverse students are viewed as a liability rather than an asset. We're not taking into account their background and their history and their culture, and looking at it as great. Well, how can I use that to better my educational practice, and how can I use that to bolster the student and make things better for them? But it's more of I don't want to take that into account, and I don't want to have to deal with that, and I'm not interested in that, and it's going to be more difficult, and I've taken into account their language, and I'm not going to do that. And so they're being seen as a negative rather than a positive. They're being labeled with negative attributes of being defiant, deviant, disruptive, lazy. So the overall goal is to change that mindset, to start looking at these kids and different cultures as a good thing, and as something that we can use to better our teaching methods and to reach more kids. The second is to gain a better understanding of what it is meant by culture. And in here they define it as a behavior learned from the home or the community that is passed down from a generation to generation and represents our heritage. Holly has identified 7 separate cultural connections: race, gender, age, nationality, religion, ethnicity, and class. And all of these, except for race, speaks to who we are and why we behave certain ways, why we do the things that we do, why we say the things that we say. They're all intrinsically linked to our behaviors and who we are, except for race. Race is the only piece that holds no influence in our behaviors. She clearly says that our racial identity is very clear. It's a biological DNA representation that gives us our blood lineage, that otherwise really doesn't tell us anything about who we are as an individual. Point being that our racial identity has nothing to do with our culture identity. They are both a piece of who we are, and they are both important to us, but they are not, race, our racial identity doesn't directly affect our cultural identity. And then culture is defined in terms of culturally and linguistically responsive as a central feature, which is the ethnocultural identity, which we talked about a couple slides ago when they were talking about the overgeneralization. So to illustrate this idea, the book again gives another example, which is the why I have a picture of a washer and dryer here, just like I had a picture of kids in a gym. We're talking about our gym of the underserved. It demonstrates this understanding and this concept with some questions. And so the way that they had to do it in the book, they explained it in the first chapter, is they want you to think of your answers to a couple of questions that I'm going to read, and then think about them as I explain it. So the first one is, let's see, what did it say? It was, why do you celebrate the 4th of July if you are a U.S. citizen? Secondly, where do you wash your clothes? These seem like kind of weird questions, which I totally get because I didn't understand where that was going either. But in this whole idea, they want you to now think of it this way. Do you celebrate the 4th of July because of your ethnicity or because you are a citizen of the United States? So by knowing where, so then that's that one. Then go back to the laundry. By knowing where someone washes their clothes, someone's economic status can typically be correctly assumed. So if you do your laundry at a laundromat, the assumption would be that you may be lower or working of a lower or working class socioeconomic class. If you wash your clothes at home, then you have your own washer and dryer, you're probably more middle class. And if you send your clothes away to be washed at the laundromat, not the laundromat, but like a dry cleaners or something, very likely that you are probably the part of the upper class. So the finding of these two simple questions is this, that the 4th of July you celebrate is not, or in the Independence Day more accurately, that you celebrate is not determined by your ethnocultural identity. It's defined by your national culture. And whether you wash your clothes in a laundromat or at home, or if you send it to the dry cleaners, speaks to your economic identity rather than your racial identity. So all of these identities that we have are, again, intrinsically linked, but they're not, it's this and all of these things. It's this, or it's your socioeconomic identity rather than your racial identity. And it's all of these different things. And so these simple questions that seem super silly and, who cares about that? They're important, and they all speak to a different part of who we are. And so while our ethnocultural identity is the primary focus of this culturally and linguistically responsive pedagogy, it doesn't exclude the need to be sensitive and aware of all of those other cultural identities. So the author gives an example right here. She lists these different identities in rings, and they are called the rings of culture. And we can look at this little diagram right here. And we see that there are 5 different and separate rings. There's youth, gender, religion, nationality, and ethnic or ethnicity. And these should not be confused for one, these are all one thing, or they should not be confused for one of, you don't confuse your age and gender and religion and nationality. Don't confuse them for another, because those don't confuse those identities as, well, this is my racial identity, and that is the reason that I do this, and this is my national and my ethnic, and they're all different. And confusing them for one another goes back to that idea of overgeneralizing one thing for something else. And so, it's an important factor of not mixing those up and not just kind of being like, oh, well, it's because of this. You need to be intentional and specifically and sensitive to all of it. So we're going to watch one more video really quick. This is a 4-minute video. And this is going to talk more about culturally relevant.
I think people, when they use the term culturally responsive or culturally relevant pedagogy, forget that the base of the word is culture. So culture has to do with worldviews, beliefs, language. It has to do with values.
Culture, to me, at its essence, are the things that, those filters that help us as human beings make sense out of the most ordinary things. Culture can be grouped into 2 different kind of categories. You can talk about visible culture and invisible culture, or tangible and intangible. The tangible, I would translate that to say the crafts, the music, the art, the technology. And those are important, but I think the more important are the intangible. And these are values, beliefs, feelings, opinions, perspectives, assumptions.
So culturally relevant pedagogy, one of the primary premises is that teachers take students' everyday lived cultural experiences and make the appropriate linkages between what the students know and do and understand, and come up with examples, comparisons, and contrasts. They make the connections. They are cultural translators. They are cultural bridge builders. I think when we talk about culturally responsive pedagogy, we have to remember that students approach learning not as cultural blank slates. So they bring into the classroom all of those cultural experiences. And so it is very compatible with what we know about good teaching. Culturally responsive pedagogy builds on students' prior knowledge. And in this case, we're talking about prior cultural knowledge, making connections between what is known and what is to be taught and understood.
So part of the argument of culturally responsive teaching is the dilemma has been an incompatibility between the cultural filters that have been used to send instructional messages to students that's coming from the school frame of reference, and when kids from different ethnic backgrounds are trying to learn that, they are trying to receive what we send from school through another set of cultural filters. And if they don't match, then nothing's happening. So cultural responsive teaching then says is that rather than always insisting that the students adapt to the culture of the school needs to adapt and modify some of its sending messages, its sending mechanism.
When we think about what matters most about culture, I think the first thing to remember is that students are not mere representatives of a cultural or ethnic group. And first and foremost, they are individual students who have individual needs and interests, etc. Students who belong to an ethnic group, their attachment and bonds to the group vary, for example, in terms of how long they've been in this country, social class, and their own experiences in their community and neighborhood.
Because if we think about students' culture, we make culture a trait of that individual based on his or her membership in a particular community, conflating race and ethnicity with culture. We don't take race off the table at all, but we're really pulling apart what culture is and making sure we don't conflate it, because if we do, then we make cultural practices a trait of that person's membership in that particular community. And that leads us, of course, to make very easily slip into one size fits all, that my Latino children learn this way, or my African American children need X, right? And so it's making culture a trait of the individual that's been very problematic in the implementation of culturally relevant pedagogy.
Okay, so notice in there that the second gal that spoke was Geneva Gay, the writer of the second book about culturally responsive teaching theories research. She was the writer that influenced moving it from culturally responsive teaching and added the concept of pedagogy into that, to the idea of this concept. So the next part that we look at is in promoting validation and affirmation. Remember that this was a part of the definition of what it meant to be culturally linguistically responsive. So this idea is that cultural behaviors which have previously been looked at as being negative or disruptive or any of those other negative connotations we used earlier within the schools are the ones that need to be instead validated, and we need to flip that framework and validate them and affirm them and use those cultural, like this, that these kids aren't coming to school as a cultural blank slate. They're coming with all of these already rooted and foundational behaviors, and we need to validate and affirm and use those in our teachings and use those things to reach these children. And the other part was that once the home culture norms, once those behaviors have been addressed and educators can work on bridging the gaps between school and the mainstream norms, you can bridge those gaps between the things that you keep trying to change, or that not, but they keep trying to get changed, and like, oh, don't do that anymore, we need to be like this, and changing that mindset, you can then bridge the gap between these two things, between school and home cultures, between what is seen as like the mainstream norm and the cultural and linguistic approach, and you can be the gap between those two things and bring them together. So then we've also talked several times about ethnocultural behaviors. The use of these behaviors can be defined as characteristics of cognitive, affective, and psychological behaviors that serve as relatively stable indicators of how learners perceive, interact, and respond to the learning environment. So there's all those things in our makeup and who we are and whatever that we use to learn and interact and respond to those different situations, and in this case, in the school. So the next part is called the focus on linguistic behaviors. To be linguistically responsive, we need to understand these three absolutes. The first one is that all language is good for the communicative purpose that it serves. So talking, dialogue, learning, teaching, all of that. All linguistical forms are rule-governed and systematic and are not haphazardly put together, as sometimes it may seem. And we learn language, we as people learn language that is spoken in the home and by our primary caregivers, first and foremost. Speak English at home, the kid's going to learn English. If you teach them Spanish, they're going to learn Spanish. We learn the language that's spoken at home. We learn the language that we hear most frequently, and these are the three absolute truths as far as linguistic behavior goes. So when we teach with these 3 points in mind, it allows for more open discussion in all aspects, and aspects that concern the non-standard language that we talked about a couple slides ago, which we're going to see among all of our students, but specifically among the students that we identified as being students that are underserved. So the use of different languages in and out of the home, in and out of the school environment, in both of those places, both of them deserve to be validated and respected. And we as educators need to be intentional about that, about validating all of the different things that we see that our kids bring to us. So the next part about this is called situational appropriateness. This was one of the last subsections that we talked about, and the author ends this chapter, chapter 1, talking about situational appropriateness, and caps it off by saying, and this is quoted from her in the book, when educators recognize students' linguistic behavior or the use of rules of home language as positives and not deficits, they can then begin to validate and affirm the student's language. Consequently, teachers can begin the process of building and bridging that will enable students to function within the language of schools. Then, to go in with that top one, they talk about situational appropriateness and using what she just said in that paragraph about affirming and validating student language and building the bridge and being the bridge that enables those students to function within the language of schools and their home cultures, and doing that she talks about using this in the context of situational appropriateness, which is defined as determining what cultural or linguistic behavior is most appropriate for the situation. So that's why it's called situational appropriateness. Is it appropriate for this situation? Is it appropriate for this one? Both, either or, only one, the whole idea. So when we teach this culturally, linguistically responsive pedagogy, we are teaching the opportunity for students to have the skills to recognize situational appropriateness and to be able to use either this and or this, and to make that distinction for themselves. This also goes hand in hand with code switching or culture switching, which is another thing that they addressed in the same area. The definition for that was just the act of switching from one culture or linguistic behavior to another for the purpose of being, as we defined earlier, situationally appropriate. Having that recognition of, okay, is it appropriate to do this or appropriate to do this, or if I use this language over here or this one over here, but not having the okay, well, I can never do this, it's always this one, but being able to have both of those options is part of why being culturally linguistically responsive is so important, because we're not curbing one or fostering just one, we're fostering both, and the opportunity for the students and us, everybody, to be able to make that distinction and use them both. So this concept, both of these concepts, both of these definitions allow students to make choices about culture and language based on situations, instead of the either or, instead of feeling like they can't. And this is pivotal for the being culturally responsive, linguistically responsive. That is the end of the PowerPoint. So through this, you should have seen or found the singular definition, the term, the 7 identities, and been able to tell me which one is excluded, and the 4 key aspects of being culturally linguistically responsive, which was more towards the end. Hint, hint. So the assignment, that's the little written assignment piece of it. The activity is attached to the form, and it is a crossword puzzle that has definitions that we defined throughout this chapter and that are in the reading as well as on the PowerPoint and that I have verbalized. So it shouldn't be too difficult. Anyways, have a good week, great class, and we'll see you next week.